Good morning. So we have great pleasure having FDA expert Andreu Badal talking about the very important issue. So about AI software regulation, and mostly we all very much interested. And Andreu is our active collaborator. We actually have an active R01 and in this space. And his expertise is on Monte Carlo X-ray simulation and acceleration, also computational modeling, and digital phantoms, so on, and AI software regulation. So let's welcome Andreu. So please.
Thank you, Professor Wang, for the introduction, and thank you very much, the organizers. It's a big privilege to be able to present to you this morning. That's not. So I will talk to you about the regulatory process for image processing software devices, and also a little bit of our latest research in this field. And I know it's a Saturday morning, so before we start, I would like to explain a story, because to start a little slow, it's a long day, and yesterday we had like fantastic talks. So just like take a couple of minutes to go back to 1984. That's actually a picture of my 5th birthday. You can see in the first, but it's not me first, it's my brother with the classic Barcelona soccer shirt, my cousin behind, and back there in the background, it's me by the tree. And recently I got this picture, and I was very excited, but of course it doesn't look great. This is an old film that my father developed in the attic. It's very grainy, noisy, and I'm blurred because I'm out of focus. I'm in the background. So some other people would think that it's just a bad picture, but in our field, we have read probably too many image processing papers, right? And it looks like there is no such thing as a bad picture anymore. It's just not sufficiently post-processed. That's what it feels when you read these papers. So I went online and I looked for a image restoration software, and I found a website that was implementing this generative facial prior GAN, and they promise fantastic results to enhance faces from all pictures. So I ran it, and that's what I got. And it does look, in the first look, it looks improved. You can see a lot of differences, but not very well from that distance. So that's the link to the presentation. My question is, which of these pictures has the best image quality, right? Image quality, it's the key of this workshop and our entire field. And it's a very loaded question, very complicated. And you need several metrics. You cannot just say image quality, like good or bad on its own. Would be a huge discussion. So let's see what happened to my cousin after processing. So that happened. And let's see what happened to my face. And that happened. So what do you think? Let's use some pixel-based metrics. So which image is sharper, has better contrast, noise, root mean square error, or peak signal to noise ratio, structural similarity, or in touch-based metrics here, it could be, for example, can we see the people in this photo? That's what we always do, right? We look at a picture, we always look for the people. And the most important for me is it me in any of these pictures? And what do you think? I'll tell you what I think. For the sharpness, definitely the GAN wins. You can see below here in the, like this line here in the wall behind me was blurred there. It's perfectly sharp. So if you calculate an MTF here, will be like fantastic. For contrast, yeah, if you look at like the eyes and the mouth has better contrast, the GAN wins. For noise, well, noise, it's a big win for the GAN. Like look at the wall behind me, it's completely flat and uniform, and it was very noisy. And root mean square error, structural similarity, signal to noise ratio, that's actually useless in this case. We don't have ground truth. So these metrics are great for a loss function, easy to train and all this. But remember, this is not useful in a practical case because you need ground truth. And if you have ground truth, then you don't need to post-process any low quality image. So So it's not a useful metric in this case. Thank you. Yeah. So let's go to task-based metrics. Detecting people in this image, I would say it's a tie. It's a very easy task for people. So everybody can see the three people in that photo with no problem. Some people could argue that the gun it's easier because sharper and all this, but I would argue also that there has been here, the gun has made some magic there. It has like inherently done a face detection. So it's kind of a computer-aided detection thing under the hood. It has detected these faces and it has applied the face prior on the faces, right? So yes, in this case, maybe these ones easy look good, but if there was a face that was a person was very blurred in the background, probably I think a human would be better at seeing it. And if the gun doesn't see it and doesn't apply the prior, it would be easily missed by a person that expects the prior. Also, if there were noise in the image that kind of the gun thinks it's a face, you could find like a perfectly defined face in the noise, which could be a false positive, false negative. And we see this in medical imaging, right? It could be perfectly something that happened like in a PET image or in an MRI where now a lesion appears or a lesion disappears. And the final metric, it's actually the only one that I care. That this is a family photo, so all I care is about, my face and my family face. And like when my parents look at this picture, they really don't want to see this like stranger there. I mean, it is not me. So it's not a valid photo. Like a photo with these like strangers doesn't belong in my family photos, right? So I would argue that this has zero image quality. The gun-generated image has zero image quality because it doesn't meet the purpose of remembering my memories, right? Yeah, so some minimal information has been preserved, the color of my skin or like the black and white shade of my skin and the kind of hairstyle has been preserved, but this is like a few bits of information. The actual face has been replaced by this prior to make me look like a celebrity or something like that, right? So I would like to find a metric that can tell me that. Like we typically use root mean square or things like that, and it fails in this case very clearly. So ideally, we'd have a metric that would tell us this one below looks much better, but it's fake. It's not acceptable. So now let's go to the topic of the talk itself. We all know, we're very aware that this image processing software has been very aggressively translated into clinical practice. And there's a lot of promise, no doubt. It's a lot of good things will come from these algorithms, but it is really, really fast. From like someone puts a paper in the archive, and 2 years later, there may be an FDA submission requesting using this with patients. So we had never seen that. It's incredibly fast. So the takeaway point here would be we need urgently sophisticated methods to evaluate the performance of these sophisticated image enhancement devices, because I have the feeling we are using metrics from the 20th, maybe 19th century, a mean square error, to evaluate algorithms from the 21st century. And there's, I know, a lot of incentive to create new sophisticated AI software, not so much incentive to create sophisticated image evaluation thing. That's like a bias that we know in science happens. The coolest thing is making the processing, not the evaluation. But we really should do it because I think it's stopping our field from actually advancing, right? We have like so many processing, and maybe any of the noise are made like 2 years ago, it's kind of maybe useless. Maybe we'll never be cited that paper 2 years ago, just because now there is something better that gives a better root mean square error, and everybody will cite that, right? I think the metrics are keeping us back. So, and if you think I'm going to tell you what metric to use, yes, I will do it later, but you may not agree. No. So for the regulatory parts of my talk, I'm, of course, at the Food and Drug Administration. Everybody knows the FDA, but very few people know actually the huge variety of things that the FDA does. So I'll review the official definition. The Food and Drug Administration is responsible for protecting the public health by ensuring the safety, efficacy, and security of the human drugs, veterinary drugs, biological products, medical devices, food products that are not part of the Department of Agriculture, cosmetics, and also products that emit radiation, for example, lasers. So that's a lot of different topics within the FDA. But personally, I'm in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health. So we deal with medical devices and these radiation-emitting products. Within CDRH has about 2,000 employees for reference. And within CDRH, I'm in the Office of Science and Engineering Laboratories, kind of like the research branch, but we also participate in the regulatory process. A fraction of our time, it's consulting for the reviews of the medical devices. So the OCEL provides more than 3,000 consoles to the CDRH. So these are devices that are being cleared and get information from actual scientists that we try to be at the state of the art so that we can more efficiently evaluate like innovative devices, right? With the purpose of like having the best devices in the market and making sure it's safe. Within OCEL, I'm in the division of imaging, diagnostics, and software reliability. So we deal with medical imaging. We have actually 4 research programs, medical imaging and diagnostics, digital pathology, mixed extended reality, and AI/ML, which not surprisingly, it's taking over the other 3 because, I mean, digital pathology and AI, it's kind of indistinguishable at this moment. So how does this work for regulating devices? And later I will focus on medical image enhancement software. The first step, the FDA does a risk-based classification of the devices. So there's class 1 is the lowest risk, like gloves or face masks. And there's class 2, and then class 3 is the higher risk typically, like this stent. This determination for the level of risk depends on the technology of the device, but also in the intended use. Intended use is a key word for the FDA. The definition of intended use is the general purpose of the device or its function. And it includes inside the indications for use, which is slightly different. It's a little more specific. So the disease or condition that the device will diagnose, treat, prevent, cure, or mitigate. And it may include what patient population, like adults, pediatrics, and who are the users of the device. And all this, it's in the code of federal regulations. And I have a lot of links and references to the actual regulations. So please check the map to get the latest and more accurate information. For imaging, sometimes the intended use is really general. For CT, for example, it can be something like CT is intended to produce cross-sectional images of the body by computer reconstruction of X-ray transmission data. Very, very generic. And in fact, if the intended use is more specific, then you may need to provide extra evidence to justify that specific use. So within this life cycle of these medical devices, the FDA separates the pre-market and the post-market section. The pre-market is this risk-based classification, and you have the class 1 devices that have to comply with some general controls. Class 2, I'll explain later, can go to this 510K pre-market notification process. And class 3 have to go to a pre-marketing approval that I will mention. There is also other things that can be done. Pre-submission, it's very recommendable. If you have if you are thinking of submitting a medical device, you're encouraged to make a pre-submission where you will be able to get to ask questions to the reviewers that will eventually review your device and get feedback so that you can, for example, you want to do a clinical study. So it's always better to talk with the FDA statistician that will review the study so that you don't have to redo it at the end, right? So it's encouraged to do pre-submissions. And there's also things like investigational device exemption. So in some cases, if you want to do a clinical trial, you need to use a device. You may be asked by your IRB to, for example, to request the FDA this exemption. So you can use this device that is not approved in the clinical trial. It's not always necessary. There are like rules. And finally, there's this novel petition that I will talk later. In the post-market section, there's also a lot of activity. There's compliance activities, inspections of the facilities, recalls, and also a lot of surveillance of the market. So that's adverse event reporting, medical device reports, trends, and signals. So the FDA tries to control that the market it's safe, right? That there's no suddenly a lot of adverse events in one class of device that would trigger probably an investigation. So starting with the most common process is this 510K pre-marketing notification. So that's for class 2 devices, that is the vast majority in our field. And the way it works is, in plain language, you need to show that your device it's equivalent to a previous one, that it's already clear. So we call the subject device, it's a new one, and the old one is the predicate device. And whoever is sending the submission, it's called the sponsor or the manufacturer. So here's how it works. There requires to be a determination that the new device, the subject device, is substantially equivalent to a legally marketed device, that is the predicate device. And substantial equivalence means that it has the same intended use and the same technological characteristics, or has the same intended use and different technological characteristics, but these new characteristics do not raise new kinds of questions of safety and effectiveness, and the data can demonstrate that the new device is as safe, as effective as the predicate, right? So that's the process that AI software has used. Most AI software has predicates like denoising. There were denoisers before. So most of them have been able to use a predicate denoiser that is not AI. The AI section has the same intended use, has different technological characteristics, but with enough evidence, it didn't raise new questions. It's still denoising, and it can be proved to be safe and effective. So that's the process that most AI goes. It's a new technology, but still can go through this substantial equivalence process. For class 3 devices, the only way to do it's the pre-market approval, which is it's much more time consuming, it's more stringent, and there's a need for much more scientific evidence that it's safe and effective, usually more clinical testing and things like that. And once a device is approved, the word is approved with a PMA, then it still cannot be clear with 510Ks. The modifications, all modifications have to be PMA supplements. So it stays in this class 3 category. And if somebody wants to build a similar device, they have to start with a PMA and supplements. And this doesn't need to be like this forever. There is a process we call down classification, where the FDA at a certain moment can decide that a device that was class 3, now it's class 2, and they will make rules, like regulations. And from that moment, 510K, it's possible, right? For example, a few years back, digital mammography was class 3. All mammography units had to be PMA, the new ones. But at this moment, you can get a clear digital mammography unit with 510K. And another one that it's quite common in our field is this de novo classification. If somebody comes with a very innovative device, there's nothing like that in the market. I mean, that could be very good for patients, right? Innovation, but there's an issue. That type of device doesn't exist. So by default, it goes to class 3, the high risk and pre-marketing approval. And sometimes manufacturers want to argue that it could be classified somewhere else. So they can do a de novo petition and request that the device is classified as class 1, usually class 2. And then the FDA will evaluate it, and eventually it may be granted. And if it's granted, the FDA will create regulations that create a new type of devices and will create special controls. So that's like a few items that have to be completed for this kind of device. And now this device can be used as a predicate in a 510K process. Now I'll show an example. I've been asked many times, what kind of evidence do we review? So essentially, the FDA doesn't have limits on the evidence that we can get. So any evidence you have, you can send. But logically, the most valuable evidence is clinical trials, double-blind clinical trials. But it's not common that people do like double-blind clinical trials for like a denoising software, right? But some clinical testing, it can be done, like radiologists evaluating images. Bench testing is essential for like any imaging application, right? Phantoms and all the MTF, NPS, all these. Animal testing, it's allowed, of course, too. And computational modeling and simulations, it's not commonly used, but it can be used. And we have published about this, and it's something that FDA is interested in promoting this because, of course, manufacturers are using so much computer modeling and simulation, and it's unfortunate that this doesn't. It's something that could help in the regulatory process and make everything more efficient. And it is a possibility, and hopefully in the future will increase. An important detail is that every time the device is changed in a substantial way and the performance it's likely to change, typically a new submission to the FDA would be required. So many manufacturers are submitting like 510Ks like every year with new versions of the device. For AI, this has a big implication that you may not like. If you retrain your network or you change the architecture because you think it's going to work better, that is changing the performance of the device, right? So you need a new submission. So I know some manufacturers would like to be retraining it all the time, like they do in consumer electronics, right? Like Facebook and Google keep updating their networks like every week, but in medical devices, that's not usually the case. But there's an exception I will mention. Finally, just want to point out there is something called medical device development tool. So it's something that you can do in academia or companies. If you have a tool that can help in the regulatory process, can be a phantom or simulation software or a test, whatever, you can submit to this process and it's free. And the FDA reviewers will evaluate it as if kind of as a medical device, but it's not a medical device. And it will, if it's qualified, then this tool can be used in the regulatory process and the FDA will not need to review evidence anymore. For example, there's an MDDT that it simulates MRI machines and calculates the heating of the pacemaker inside a patient, right? So that's something very important in the regulatory process. And at this moment, it's mostly done only with computational modeling. And before you could do computational modeling, but every time the reviewer would have to validate that this software it makes sense and it's solid. But now there are some MDDTs that can do this. So if you choose to use that tool, then the reviewer will just say, okay, are you using it for the context of use and that version and all? And we don't need to review it. So it's less like uncertainty in the process. And hopefully it saves time manufacturers. So please let's check it out. MDDTs. So now, bringing it closer to the image processing software that I promised, this software is almost in all cases cleared through a 510K. So you just need if you have to identify a predicate that has the same intended use and then demonstrate that it's substantially equivalent and that the new technology you're using, it's not affecting the safety and efficacy. And the process is really not different than any other algorithm. We don't have like magic way to do this. We review the performance, and the main difference compared to older algorithms is that we typically need to see information on the network architecture and the training and testing data set, just because it's essential to know if it's safe and effective, right? That may not exist in the predicate, but with the new technology, we need to see this information. And by the way, we don't typically see any source code or we don't run any code. So that's not part of the process. We just depend on the information descriptions of the manufacturers. And just for historical reference, in 1994, there was a neural network device clear with a PMA. It's this cervical cytology. So it's like a CAT software. So it's quite interesting that it's actually 30 years old technology. There may be someone here interested in CAT software. It's kind of extreme case of image processing. The FDA actually defines 5 different kinds of CAT software. There is computed-aided detection, computed-aided diagnosis, computed-aided detection and diagnosis together, computed-aided triage and notification, and computed-aided radiological acquisition and optimization guidance. And the reason we have these 5 it's very easy. Each class of device comes from a de novo process from back in the day. So each one has special controls that need to be complied. And some of them have guidance documents. The FDA produces these guidance documents that it's optional information that can help manufacturers submit information. And if you're interested, you can look at this regulation and this guidance for CAT. So all this, I know it was very abstract, so I want to show some examples, real examples. Every time the FDA clears or approves a device, there is most of the information is private, it's confidential, manufacturer data, but there is a public summary that is published. I encourage everybody to check for this. Like any device you use, it has to be linked to something that was clear, and there is a public summary, and you can read it. And the way it works, there's a number here, the K number, it's for a 510K. And this one, for example, starts with 13. So that's 2013, the year it was received. And I want to show this example because this is an iterative CT reconstruction algorithm from GE. And by the way, I chose these examples, but it's not like, there could be other examples. I'm not like endorsing any particular device. It's something we have to recognize. 10 years ago, we were in a very similar place where we are today. 10 years ago, there was big improvements in the computational power in our personal computers and some mathematical breakthroughs. And this new generation of iterative reconstruction algorithms were coming to market, and they had claims very similar to what deep learning is claiming nowadays. For example, in this case, this ASIR says, designed to reduce image noise and streak artifacts, increase resolution, and improve low contrast detectability. So that's pretty much the same kind of claims that AI it's making nowadays. And at that moment, manufacturers had an interest in having quantitative dose reduction claims in their labeling for the FDA. And eventually, after a lot of work by companies and FDA and others, it was accepted. It's part of the public summary. And in this case, for example, this particular iterative reconstruction can have a dose reduction of 50 to 82%, and low contrast detectability improvement 59 to 135%, spatial resolution improvement up to 100%, and things like that. And there's the all-important asterisk in there, which tells you how these numbers, exact numbers, were calculated. And it's essentially with a phantom. It's a MITA CT IQ phantom. So it's like a piece of plastic with some low contrast plastic inserts. So that's something that for AI would be very out of distribution. But I think that was a good compromise. These numbers are real, but are for this phantom. And the comment says something to the effect of, in real patients, it may be different. So an interesting thing, 5 years after that clearance, there was a new version of the GE reconstruction based on AI, this deep learning image reconstruction device. And as you can imagine, if you pay attention, this device used the previous one as its predicate. So this is an AI reconstruction, but it was cleared through the 510K process because it was shown that it's substantially equivalent to the iterative reconstruction, right? That's how it works, and it has essentially the same intended use. This is a different deep learning-based iterative CT reconstruction algorithm, in this case, Canon. This one has noise reduction claims right here in the indications for use. So ACE, it's a noise reduction algorithm that improves image quality and reduces image noise by employing deep convolutional neural networks. Okay, and if you look a little further in this summary, it tells you information on how it was evaluated by the FDA. They mention that board-certified radiologists look at the images. So it doesn't mention a full clinical trial, but the radiologists evaluated the images. And also a lot of phantom studies. So that's the image quality phantom studies that were done. And I will read it because I'm sure you're interested. So phantoms were used to calculate contrast to noise ratios, CT number accuracy, uniformity, slice sensitivity profiles, the modulation transfer function with a wire, the MTF with an edge, the standard deviation of the noise power spectra, the low contrast detectability with the phantom that we talked before in the iterative. And also some pediatric protocols were tested in phantoms. So that was the evidence. That's the kind of evidence that we review, which it's very familiar to you. That's similarly to what you need for like publishing a good paper, right? Or it's well known in our field. Changing now to image enhancement software. So this is a device from 2006, Safinia Clarity, and it's a PAC system, but it can transfer and storage images, but it also has claim of noise reduction, contrast enhancement for multimodality images, right? And I have no idea if this device is in the market at this moment, but it's important because you probably know SuttlePet. SuttlePet was cleared to the 510K in 2018 because they were able to prove that it was substantially equivalent to the device from 2007, right? So if you look at the summary, what it says is that when you acquire PET images with the standard protocol, like same dose that you are using, full dose, full time, full contrast, and you process it with this predicate device or with SuttlePet, the final images are substantially equivalent, right? So have the same safety and efficacy profile. So that's the key for image enhancement. So this software, it looks very new, but it's not really new. There are predicates, there are software, all software, mostly in PAC system that had these same kind of functions with older algorithms. And that's how they are being cleared through this process, because they are likely to be not inferior that software that was cleared 15 years ago, right? The last example is this CAD acquisition and optimization de novo. So this is a very interesting device, caption guidance, which according to the press, maybe now owned by GE Healthcare, came to the FDA with a very innovative design. It's an AI software that tells a user that is not an expert sonographer how to move the ultrasound probe to acquire professional grade images, right? So they have tests, for example, with registered nurses that with a little training and this software, that like with arrows and stuff, they can acquire good images. So that's very innovative. There was no predicate identified. So the company, instead of going through the PMA, they requested de novo classification, and they considered that they requested that this, instead of a class 3 as a new device, a new unclassified device, they requested be classified as class 2, and eventually the FDA agreed, and they created the FDA created this new regulation. So that's the Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 892.2100. You can go to the Code of Federal Regulations, and there you will find this section titled Radiological Acquisition and or Optimization Guidance System. And it's a new class of device, it didn't exist, but it's class 2. And then from now on, any device that does this can use the 510K process and use this as its predicate, right? And as part of this process, there was a special controls that have to be complied. All that use this as 510K have to comply with the special controls. And there is something very interesting that I wanted to show you. In these special controls, there is a predetermined change control plan. So I mentioned that you cannot retrain your network and market it without FDA approval. Well, in this case, because the special controls allows it, this software can be, in some circumstances, retrained. And this plan explains how, in what circumstances it can be modified the algorithm, and how these modifications will be internally evaluated by the company without requiring FDA input, right? So it allows for some like kind of growth and improvement of this software, and you can look at it. This has appeared in some de novo special controls. If you want to know the final, more up-to-date regulations, please visit the Digital Health Center of Excellence at CDRH. They have the experts. These regulations are being, they are changing. It's a field that's going very fast. So, the FDA is trying to catch up. So please look at the latest up there. Okay, so I want to show also some of the research that we do in my division on this field. As I mentioned, I'm in the Office of Science and Engineering Laboratories. This is the vision. I like how we call our vision: transform the lives of patients by generating renowned and transparent regulatory science that streamlines the medical device review process. So the projects we work on are different than the more basic that NIH would fund. For example, it's more applied, but not completely applied to make new products. It's more for the evaluation, right? And simulation software and phantoms, things like that. And many of these tools that we create are in this catalog of regulatory science tools. So if you're interested, you can check it out. So why do we need this research in this area? Well, first, because image processing is not at all a new thing. It has been like so much work on segmentation, denoising, image enhancement, and it comes from the first days of digital computers, right? This is an article I like a lot from Dr. Joseph, Image Noise and Smoothing in Computed Tomography Scanners. And it's one of the few papers I've seen that actually demonstrates that there is a clinical advantage of smoothing the image. And actually, this paper ends up with like a demand that manufacturers allow reconstruction kernels with the smooth and sharp features, which I thought it was something that I always took for granted. But originally, he was using the ME Mark I scanner, so the first ever commercial scanner, and it had only one reconstruction. And he showed that we need like sharp and smooth kernels. So iterative reconstruction has even more regularization. So denoising has been part of CT since forever. And by the way, when I presented this slide, someone in the room just told me that Professor Joseph had passed away past months. So IAPM had sent an email and I shared. I don't know him, but this paper is fantastic. And I recommend also this paper from the 70s. It's very interesting. Look at the references. They talk about things like noise cheating, which is what they call denoising, and very weird things that are actually very like an inspiration for like young people. Well, I find it very inspiring to see how they were figuring out the field at the time. AI methods have better performance in any metric, kind of what I showed at the beginning, but that I think mainly because the metrics you are using are not very adequate for this adaptive thing, right? So yes, it seems to work better, but it's very difficult to tell by the user if there's a problem or not. And also these algorithms never know rarely know the task. They don't know there's disease there. So if you evaluate the entire frame, it may be fantastic, but the radiologists will only look at a few pixels really to see if there is disease. So that's something that should be incorporated. Actually, yesterday, Webb and other people, I'm very happy they are using this physics and task-based features inside the noisers and reconstruction. So that's very valuable, I think. Sometimes it's also not clear the benefit for the patient. At least to me, like, is it we are denoising to reduce the dose to the patient or to reduce the acquisition time or reduce the time it takes to reconstruct in the computer or sometimes just nicer images. Like sometimes like say, oh, the image is nicer, but they don't make a relation to any clinical reason why you would make a nicer image. So I think it's important for a risk benefit. Like, for example, if you're an older person going through radiation therapy, probably dose reduction, it's not very important compared to misdiagnosis, right? And anyway, I see some of these topics that we have in our field kind of remind me of problems that we are seeing in the press now with ChatGPT. Like people ask a difficult question and then they go crazy saying, oh, the ChatGPT, it's lying. The answer is it's really bad. But if you look at the answer, it's not really that bad. It is grammatically impeccable, like 100% good grammar. 99% of the words are truth and adequate. It's just 1% of the words that say a lie, right? And we reject the entire response because, it has one lie. And I think the same can apply in radiology, right? You process a CT scan that has one lesion, and after processing this, maybe like 200 pixels are blurred and are not visible. Well, the image, it's not usable at all. It doesn't matter the rest of the pixels. So ChatGPT, in their GPT-4, they had this warning already. Like, despite its capabilities, GPT-4 has similar limitations as earlier GPT models. It's still not fully reliable. It hallucinates facts and makes reasoning errors. Great care should be taken in high-stakes contexts. So maybe you should add some of these in some of these algorithms. It's kind of we're putting the cart before the horses. Like, we have a very good image processing software, but we don't have very good evaluation software. So that's why any issue of medical physics now have like 10 papers saying our denoiser is the best ever, but they never compare to each other, right? And you never know which one of the 10 is the best. It's confusing. And these are just like theoretical reasons, but there's also practical applications. For example, this is work that Rongping Zheng and Brandon Nelson in my division have been working. It has been identified that some of these denoisers perform much worse in pediatric patients. This, for example, here below, it's a low-dose CT scan of an adult, and after AI denoising, it looks denoised like very much smooth. But when you use a newborn patient and you change the field of view for this newborn size patient, it's very noisy first, and after denoising, it's the same amount of noise. So here you can see in this plot a 35 centimeter diameter patient, adult, has like 60% dose reduction, and when you reduce the diameter, at the end it's almost no reduction. And this was identified to be linked to the changes in the field of view of the reconstruction, and so it's something that I think could be addressed like as augmentation in the training or something. This denoiser was not trained with pediatrics. That's why it's failing. It's not surprising, but we have to be aware that any clear medical device in a hospital eventually will be used in children. Even if it's rare, children get sick. So there is reasons to improve this. So probably some of you noticed those images before are not real patient images. That's simulations of the XCAT phantom. And that's my next point, and it's my personal research. In our field, we are doing a lot of computer modeling and simulations. And my idea is that we are not doing enough. We have to do even more. The simulation tools we have are really, really, really sophisticated, are reaching a point where in some contexts can be like interchangeable with the real device, in my opinion. And it's not surprising. It's just we have 50 years of advances. So this is the Ship Logan phantom. So it's a bunch of ellipses. So you can calculate the CT projections analytically. It's been super useful, and it's still useful, even though it's not super realistic. So it's 50 years. It's 1974 improvement. So I think there is even more uses for modeling and simulation. And once you have simulated images, you have ground truth, which is fantastic for AI, right? For evaluation. You can make as many noisy evaluation acquisitions as you want. You can change the pixel size, the dose, the geometry. So many advantages. And one of the reasons it's so powerful is because it leverages trends that are much, much larger than medical imaging. For example, high performance computing and GPUs. Our field we don't have to do anything, and in 6 months, our GPUs will be much faster. That's fantastic. We also are using the virtual clinical trial. So this idea that you can predict the future clinical performance of devices by simulating a virtual cohort, very powerful. Now the digital twins are very powerful. This idea that you can have like kind of an indistinguishable version of the digital and the real that are like linked together. And all these can be put together, I think, in this like futuristic vision of the metaverse. Now, I was lucky to collaborate with Professor Wang in this recent article for the development of a metaverse for intelligent healthcare. So that it's a perspective article for future. But the idea would be that when a patient requires a CT scan, it's prescribed a CT scan, like all this data, medical information that has been generated in the past should be leveraged. So a computational model of the patient could be simulated, and information from previous patients, everything in the cloud could be leveraged to find the optimal device, optimal acquisition protocol, and optimal reconstruction to get the best help for the patient, right? And all this information can revert back to help future future patients. So that's a nice vision. My personal research I created a few years ago, this MCGPU. It was a GPU accelerated Monte Carlo simulation code for simulating X-ray images. So essentially you can get images very similar to what you get in an X-ray machine, but with a virtual phantom. And the key is that it models also the noise, the blurring in the detector. So the images have a lot of realistic characteristics. Like here, you can see this virtual patient has an amalgam in the teeth. Without this metal, the reconstruction looks like that. With the metal, you get all these metal artifacts, streaks. So it's very similar to the kind of things you see in real filter back projection without any correction. I recently extended this software to simulate PET scanning. So instead of having the X-rays coming from outside, the photons are emitted from the inside, and that's also like very powerful for scatter correction and things like that. And all our software, it's in GitHub, so please check it out. A few years back, we made this virtual imaging clinical trial for regulatory evaluation. So we use this Monte Carlo simulator to model a mammography system. And then a colleague from my lab created this analytically defined procedural breast phantom. So it's a mathematically defined breast model that has a lot of complexity. It's quite realistic, and we use some finite element model to compress it as in mammography, and that's what we use as the patient. And we can generate as many as we want. In this study, we created 3,000. This phantom we voxelized. At the end, we use voxels for the Monte Carlo, and we use 50 micron pixel voxels. So that's a lot of memory, and it didn't fit in the GPUs, at least in the time. So I created this different way. I put the voxels in memory using a binary tree. So this allows you to reduce some of the memory by reusing branches that have the same kind of structure. So it's kind of a adaptive voxel. I thought it was new, but I realized that other people had invented similar things, but it's not commonly used. Voxels are really, really inefficient when you have uniform areas in these segmented phantoms. So that's the kind of images that we simulate here. In one side is a mammography image with 3 lesions here, and this is reconstructed DBT data sets of the same phantom, and we can see how this lesion is in another plane, and it's seen in this plane and not seen in this plane. And we calculated the detectability of these lesions, and we tried to replicate a virtual trial that was actually like made in reality and submitted to the FDA for approval of a real device. And our final finding was quite similar. So the key primary outcome of the modeling is that DBT is slightly better, and the primary outcome of the comparative trial was equivalent. And we were able to get details for different glandularities. There are differences in the virtual trial and real trials, definitely, but I think it was a good example of these virtual imaging trials. And all the tools we use, the model observers, the phantoms, everything, it's our GitHub. And all the 3,000 virtual patients that we image are in the cancer imaging archive, if you want. People have used it to train neural networks and things like that. So this same approach was used to evaluate mammography denoising. That's something I presented in SPI in 2019. And I'll go fast, but that's on the left, it's a 1 DBT projection. DBT has like 25 projections of the breast from a small angular range. And one of the projections is vertical, so it actually matches a mammogram. So I wanted to see if I could get this 0-degree DBT projection and compare it with a high dose mammogram, and it's a 25 times higher dose. And I use this red CNN AI denoiser, and well, it did work quite well. Like here, the purple is the noisy DBT projection, and the black is the real one, and the red is the processed. And you can see it's a little blurring, but it's the noise, definitely. But I was not interested just in that. I used some pixel metrics to evaluate peak SNR and structural similarity. And on the left is the noisy image. And after processing it, yes, it increased. But what does it tell? Not clear. I also blur the image with a Gaussian, and I also got much better pixel SNR. So it doesn't tell us much. But then because I have these lesions inside, I did the same as before, a virtual clinical trial where I had 8,000 lesions, and I used model observers to find these lesions. And for the mass detection, this is the mean image of this 5,000 in mammography. And after denoising, it looks like this. It's a little blur, but the detectability, the area under the ROC, it's pretty much the same. It doesn't make much of an effect, the denoising, because the mass it's large. It doesn't, the pixel variance doesn't really affect you. For the microcalcification, on the other hand, the post-processing blurs completely these calcs, and it's just impossible to find it. And actually, the one that works the best is the Gaussian in this case. In a surprising turn of events, I shared this data with Craig Abbey, and he made a big mathematical analysis of this that I will not try to explain. But he found out that most of the denoising we can see, like 99.4% of the effect, could be replicated with this kernel that looks very Gaussian. So this is a case where I use a 10-layer deep learning denoiser, but it turns out it was 99% a linear convolution. That was his take. So that's something we have to keep in mind. Especially this is mammography, the background has a lot of anatomical noise. So really, there's not a lot to learn from that. It's really random. So it did learn the most efficient. Gaussian blurring, it's the most efficient when you have really zero structure. So that's very recent research presented in SPIE. I think I will not go into detail, but something that I realized is that in photography, especially in cell phone photography, they have many of the same issues that we are seeing, but they are a few years ahead of us because cell phones make amazing photos, but it's not that they have amazing sensors. It's because of the post-processing and the acquisition that they do. So there's this ISO 12233 and IEEE 1858 specifically for image quality in cell phone photography, and it has interesting information. You can check it out. And one of the takeaways is that measuring resolution in one metric, it's not enough. You need multiple metrics. And if all the metrics, all the measurement methods agree, then that's good. Probably there's not a lot of image processing going on. If these different methods have like very different like MTF, that means there has been processing, and different processing methods will change differently different methods, right? So one of the systems that they found more resilient to image processing is this Siemens star. It's a sinusoidal star. And I developed methods to put it in my simulations. You can buy these kind of things like online, but it's impossible to manufacture it with the resolution that we need. And also you cannot manufacture it with a sinusoidal shape. So I think using modeling and complex targets may be better than just using a slanted edge that we use like in mammography for MTF, right? And I was also very intrigued by this dead leaves phantom we have here. That's something that they use that actually the image itself, it's the pattern, and it's built to resemble kind of a natural image. So I decided to try to update this for mammography. So that's a possible metric. I don't know if it's very recent work. I don't know. You may disagree, but what I'm using, I have this breast phantom. I create an ideal projection with very tiny pixels, no noise, no scatter, and it's this here, the ideal image. And this is the image with the realistic detector. There's quantum noise, there is blurring in the detector, fluorescence, all of this. And then that's what they use for this dead leaves phantom. You calculate the spatial frequency response, which is essentially the equivalent to the MTF. And it's very easy. You just calculate the power spectrum of the output image and divide it by the power spectrum of the input image. The power spectrum tells you how much information is there at each frequency. So when you do the ratio, it tells you how much of the information at each frequency was transmitted through the system, which is pretty much the definition of the MTF. And you have to be careful because the noise, in this case, can hide a signal. So one of the problems. But it did work a little. So here the important curve is here. The blue dashes is the slanted edge MTF measurement, and the red line is this spatial frequency response calculated from the simulated images, and that is a pretty good match up to a point. After a certain frequency, I was not able to subtract the power spectrum of the noise sufficiently, and then it just goes crazy. But I think it's a promising method. Here below, I have some like downscaling. I got these images and I downscaled just binning 2 by 2, and then I use interpolation to go back to the original pixel size. So I knew the information was lost. Ideally, I could do this with a super resolution algorithm, but this was just spline interpolation, linear quadratic spline and cubic spline. And this is the sync function for the half pixel size. So yeah, definitely, even though the final image has the same pixel size, the information has been lost and interpolation doesn't recover it. So that's work in progress. And the final example I want to show is actually not my work. It's from Rongping Zheng and Prabhat Casey and also Brandon Nelson from my division. They presented also in SPIE, so you can check it out. It's for CT denoising, and they want to insist in this. It's known, but it's very important. The background is important. So you get different results depending on the background. So that's the main idea. You have a CT scan calculated with a quarter of the regular dose, and then you have 3 different deep learning methods to denoise it. It's 2 methods, but this has a total variation regularization inside. And the images look, denoised. And then they try to evaluate some image quality metrics. And they use a uniform phantom here on this side. And they use disks and these lines. And that's with this mostly uniform phantom. But then they also have a realistic human phantom. It also uses imaging simulation. And they inserted these disks inside the liver, and they inserted then these lines inside the liver. And that's the results that they got. On the left side, these are the results for the disks. On the right side, it's the disks in the uniform phantom. On the other side, it's the disk in the more anatomical phantom. And you can see for the disks on the right, it's actually, and this is for different Hounsfield units, right? The different contrast for this disk. And in all cases, actually, the filter back projection has the best. This is the MTF 50%, so half of the MTF. The filter back projection actually has the same performance in all the contrast, and it's actually on the top. And the denoising has a similar performance, except for the lowest contrast. The lowest contrast, the performance of the denoiser goes down, which we understand, but that's very problematic because it's usually low contrast many times. So in the anatomical phantom, these disks have a similar trend, but there's really strong fall in performance, like more than 50% fall for some of these. This other one, the NCNN, actually did a better job. So not all the AI does the same performance, but definitely it's something that we see in phantoms and in the more realistic background. There's a loss in performance, but the realistic background show even more loss. And just the same thing, but with the lines in the center, and we see the same trends. The filter back projection actually has good results, and at low contrast, it goes down. For in the realistic background, actually, the deep learning seems to boost a little the resolution. So that's promising, but then at low contrast, it goes down. So, and in their work, they have more evaluations and the noise power spectrum and all this. But it's interesting to see how the background is really affecting the performance. And that's all. I hope I was able to convince that we do need more methods. So please try to think, spend some of your time to get better evaluation methods, because otherwise I think our field will be limited. You cannot just keep making things that improve the PSNR without a link to a better clinical performance or some better metric. And the other point is that I really think that computational modeling, even though it's used a lot in our field, it really can be leveraged even more. And ideally, some of this computational modeling could be like validated and used as part of the regulatory process, which is not very common at this moment. And I think in the future, it could be very beneficial for the patients if it incorporated and the devices go faster and efficiently through the process. And that's it. With this, I'll take any question.
So this is a great talk. So I learned a lot, very systematic FDA regulatory science knowledge. And also, Andrew mentioned several great research directions. I think that makes a lot of sense. From modern control theory perspective, we need feedback. So without good regulatory science, we couldn't do AI research very well and couldn't enable clinical translation. Now we have time for a couple questions. Yeah, just wait a second. You have microphone.
Yeah, Andrew, I think this is a great talk. Thank you very much. My question is, a lot of times the vendors are not only providing tools for the end users to use, but also allow the users to train the model by themselves. For example, the release product for our radiotherapy for auto contouring, but allow us to train our own model based on our own data. How FDA will regulate this kind of product?
So, yeah, you're describing a software that, like, essentially a device that would be kind of finalized, adapted. Yeah, that could be a case that we have to be evaluated case by case. It really the rules are not written. Like and the FDA really needs feedback from industry and academia to what is the best way, because this is new thing. Some adaptation of the device and the end user, if it's part of the product labeling, it has been cleared by the FDA to work in that way, then that would be fine. Just I'm not sure how this clearance would work. There's also all these of adapting and like continually improving the devices. It's being investigated by people in my division that know much more AI than me, and there are also like deep questions, even ethical questions, like I mean, why this device has to work better in your university than in a community hospital, right? It's ideally the device would work better with all the patients everywhere. So some adaptation, it's fine. Right? Like many devices have some. The tech goes and tweaks some things, like the protocols, all these things. But yeah, I don't have an answer. Sorry, but.
I think that there are a lot of new challenging questions and opportunities. Like Xu mentioned, very important. So we have not only learning problem, also federated learning, and not only training, but also continuous training or delta tuning. So those things, number of very important research opportunities. Any further questions? Bruno.
Very nice talk. So I also like the whole virtual clinical trial framework. Are there existing benchmarks that everybody can use, or is there maybe room for defining some benchmarks so not everybody has to reinvent how to evaluate image quality, but there's like universal, here's a phantom, a task, and some ways to analyze the results?
Yeah, so, well, I would love if they existed. Actually, if this medical device development tool that I presented could be an avenue for this. So if you have something that could work like this, it could be qualified, and then it could be used without reevaluation. In practice, the FDA well, we don't have our own benchmark. Like we don't have like a secret data set that we use to evaluate, but we do accept evidence from public data sets. Like if somebody wants to use a public, like one of these denoising challenges and want to submit the results in that data set, that's valuable information. Of course, there's always this question, was this data set part of the test, the training, because it's public? But yeah, I don't think there's like specific, like for most cases, but we typically accept like evidence of the typical kind of tests that are done in the field, right? So like physical phantoms, the MITA phantom or the CAT phan, all these are excellent phantoms to provide evidence. Yeah, but it could be great. There could be more established tools that would help us, but it's not always available. Yeah.
So, Chen.
I want to have a follow-up question related to virtual clinical trial. This is very interesting. My question is that what do you think is the limitation of current techniques for virtual clinical trial, right? For example, I see it's great that you start using GPU to do some Monte Carlo simulation. Whether we can leverage the new advance in AI, for example, to use new network-based ODE or PD solver to accelerate some of the simulation, or with the new development in the hardware, for example, HPC based on GPU, whether we can leverage all this new advancement in AI or in computation to further improve the virtual clinical trial.
Yeah. So it's still not very established how to use computational modeling. There has to be some verification and validation and certainty quantification. And we have a draft guidance online that it deals with how to evaluate the verification and validation of simulation software. It's, as you know, it's very difficult, like qualifying this kind of software, but we know that like NASA, for example, qualifies software, the readiness of the software, and they trust it to simulate their spacecrafts. And also in atomic bomb development, they are using simulations, and they trust it for like national security. So I think it's totally possible to validate like Monte Carlo simulations. Maybe a generative AI in the future. That probably will take like at least a few months before we can totally validate it. But I think the key would be so is this thing of the establishing the credibility of the computational model, right? So and also all this depends on the context of use. So if you are relying a lot on the simulations, then you need a lot of validation. But if you are just trying to like claim a small part of evidence, like because you have a solid clinical testing, then you may need less validation, right? So something that in my office work was in this verification and validation 40. I think it's from the mechanical engineering. I forgot the exact. It's not in imaging, but we collaborated in a software for in a standard for verification of software, and it's kind of it shows some of the ideas that can be done to establish the credibility of software. So we're still not completely there. Now it's a case by case situation. So you want to use a virtual clinical trial to prove something to the FDA about the safety of the device. We will look at it in MRI heating. They are quite advanced, but there's not a standard way. But I would say the mindset would be similar to the same way you would use to convince us in this room that your simulations are good, right? So this is a medical thing. So I mean, any of us could end up in a hospital like next door and like be exposed to this software, right? So we all want to know that it's safe and effective. So if you can convince us like to publish a paper, right? So you need a lot of bench testing, a lot of expert assessment. So it's not very different than that, but it's difficult. Yes, at this moment, it's still a case by case.
So given limited time, last question, Guan Hong, please.
Okay, Andrew, thank you so much. This is really a thorough, detailed, and educational lecture. So I learned a whole lot. So it is amusing for me. You showed a few FDA cleared cases from G's, Acer V to blah, blah, blah. We have a few. And when I watch the claims in these FDA cleared cases like SNR, and a lot of things, the claim or the margin winning over FBP, conventional good old FBP so much. But when this product come into get commercialized, move into clinic, and in clinical society, when we evaluate all this product, there's none, to the best of my knowledge, reach even half of the claim. Essentially, all the iterative reconstruct AI, if can reduce those to 10-20%, everybody will be happy. But all the claims looks like almost 80% dose reduction. So from FDA side, I'm wondering whether you guys are thinking about some new insights or some new technique or new strategies try to mitigate this gap from the claimed benefit to clinical practice, because there is indeed a gap and that could be misleading for clinical society.
Yes, I totally agree. I mean, as the scientist, it's concerning, but in that case, so usually these indications for use don't have these like numerical values. That's something makes it a little nervous because different hospitals have different protocols. So even if you say like 20% dose reduction, like maybe the hospital next door has a protocol that has 20% dose reduction already. But still, the way it was finally agreed on, I think it's clear. It says it's in phantom studies, and everybody can see the phantom. It's publicly defined, this MITA phantom. So yes, it is, the end user has to be aware that those results may vary in practice. And it's the situation. It's kind of the whole approach for this regulation. It's based on this like substantial equivalence, right? So it is true that it's substantial equivalent to the predicate. So that it makes sense that it's clear, but at the same time, we need scientific research to go beyond and like find the real limits and the dangers and inform and please like send back the reports. Like if you think something is dangerous, you can go to the FDA and actually report software as dangerous. Or if you see in the clinic something that a patient could have been harmed, then it has to be reported. It's part of this post-market, right? So we want to make sure it's safe. But yeah, definitely, it's a reality that in practice it may not always reach what's in some of these clearance. But the same can be said for any paper, right? And it's kind of this idea that we don't have very good metrics. It is very hard. Like that's why I mentioned ChatGPT. It's very easy to know if it's lying. I mean, you just look online and you know the answer. In an image, it is very difficult to know. I mean, it may work very well most of the image, but it's difficult for us to comprehend. And it happens in papers and it happens also in regulatory. So yeah, if you have a better way to do it, please publish about that and let us know.